You were out in Calgary doing something called Goblin Macbeth.
Goblin Macbeth. When everything shut down, I think I went into isolation for 2 weeks and just kind of shook my head and thought, well, that's it. That's the end of the performing arts. Well, we're not just going to sit on our thumbs and wait for this thing to pass. We have to do something. 10 minutes before we went out on stage, one of us said, are we about to completely humiliate ourselves?
I mentioned at the top about the connection between Stratford and Star Trek.
Mm.
There are so many, and you've been on the stage at Stratford. You did Assassinating Thompson.
That's right.
And then you did the Improv.
An Undiscovered Shakespeare.
Undiscovered Shakespeare.
Yeah.
What do you think about that connection between Stratford and Star Trek and the great talent that's been on the stage here?
Well, it just makes perfect sense to me that someone who has a grasp of Shakespeare would go off to Star Trek, because some of that techno jargon, the techno babble, I think that's what they call it, is it technically English, but it's like, yeah, you have to really you have to wrap your mouth around that stuff, and I think having a grasp of Shakespeare is super helpful.
Well, that's what Patrick Stewart said when we were doing that film, Captains. He said, it's like acting a lead character, Macbeth or Hamlet. It's a major. It's like a king in Shakespeare acting in Star Trek, and you have to have that grasp of the language in order to be able to present the story properly.
Definitely.
Let's talk about the period during COVID. You're very big on improv.
Yes.
And I want to hear about how you passed the time before Star Trek came a-calling.
Well, when everything shut down, I think I went into isolation for 2 weeks and just kind of shook my head and thought, well, that's it. That's the end of the performing arts. But so there's sort of a core group of us here in Stratford who improvise together. Rebecca Northen, myself, Kevin Krushkowicz, Ijoma Mesawan. And the four of us were kind of the locals who were working on an Undiscovered Shakespeare, which is sort of the brainchild of Rebecca Northen, whose spontaneous theater shows, what they do is, including Blind Date and Legend Has It Undercover, they all focus on an audience member. We bring an audience member up on stage, we interview them. This is Undiscovered Shakespeare. We interview them about their real-life love story, and then we take a little break, and then we come back and improvise a 5-act Shakespearean play based on their love story in iambic pentameter. I think there were 7 of us in that company, plus a musician, and we'd been working on it for 5 or 6 years. We were ready to pull the trigger and do it in the 2020 season, and then everything kind of fell apart. So Ijoma, Kevin, Rebecca, and I decided, well, we're not just going to sit on our thumbs and wait for this thing to pass. We have to do something. We've got to keep, because the practice of improvising is something you just have to keep up with it. And then improvising an iambic pentameter is something that's like, wow, it's a whole other ball game. And if you go for a year without doing it, you're really going to, you're going to be starting so much further back. But so what we did was, the first thing we did was a thing called sidewalk scenes. So we would offer kind of a menu of shows to the locals, and they would book spontaneous theater to come and do a sidewalk scene, and you'd either get an improv show or a music show or an improv and music show, or there was also a kids show that Ijoma did, and we did that for the entire summer, toured all over Stratford, many driveways and parking lots in Stratford, and that kept us very busy. And then we also did a production of Romeo and Juliet at the Bruce Hotel in the Parkade. So we partnered with the hotel. They provided food service to people's cars. I think we could accommodate 8 cars in the parking garage, and then we would perform Romeo and Juliet in the center, the 4 of us. And that kept us very busy for the month of July and August. And sidewalk scenes eventually turned into backyard concerts. And then we also, under spontaneous theater, we moved indoors to the Revival House. So we did some, like a weekly improv show there called Spontaneous Theater. And yeah, it just continues to this day. Spontaneous Theater, still working on shows.
And where does music fit in? Are you performing regularly, practicing? What is your
I'm
music?
still practicing, yeah. And I when we did sidewalk scenes, I was the musical act along with my partner, Analia Gilbertson. We played as the Railbirds, so the two of us would do music. Now I'm still practicing, and I'm doing some solo shows and composing music pretty much every day.
And not so long ago, you were out in Calgary doing something called Goblin Macbeth.
Goblin Macbeth, yes.
I didn't get a chance to go to Calgary to see it, but I can only imagine what was Goblin Macbeth.
Goblin Macbeth was absolutely wild. So,
was it improv?
No, well, so years ago, Rebecca had this idea that, so when a production of, say, Hamlet is coming up, and I think initially it was going to be Goblin Hamlet, and Rebecca said, well, every time I hear about Hamlet, the first question is always, who's your Hamlet? Who's playing Hamlet? And as soon as they come out on stage, everyone is immediately comparing this performer to the one that they've seen before. And Rebecca thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you didn't know who was playing Hamlet, so you could just hear the words? And so we do a lot of mask work in spontaneous theater, and we'd found these incredible silicone masks. They're Goblins, and they're from a company in the U.S. called Composite Effects, and they provide a lot of the masks to like Game of Thrones style stuff. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if we had a goblin come out and do Hamlet or whatever, and a company of performers. So they show up in mask, and the audience is milling about, and a van pulls up, and these goblins jump out, drag the audience into the theater, and do a show. So this idea had been kicking around for a while of a goblin production. And it was always interesting that Rebecca would talk to an actor and say, so we got this idea, and what would you think about doing a goblin whatever? And she'd get one of two responses. The actor would say, so they wouldn't know who I was? No way. No way. I'm not doing all that work and not get. And then the other side would be, great. Yes, absolutely. I'd love it. So in February of this year, I was in Milwaukee, Rebecca was in Montreal, and we got a phone call from the artistic director of the Shakespeare Company in Calgary. Called Rebecca and said, I'm hooped. I've got this show, Dropout. They're supposed to open in March. It's a 2-person version of Macbeth. I'm totally hooped. And Rebecca said, well, it's a good thing you know some improvisers. And Haysom Kadri says, what have you got? And Rebecca says, I'll talk to Bruce. I'll get back to you. So she called me in Milwaukee and said, Haysom needs something. Here's a few ideas. We kicked around, the two of us going out and just improvising a Shakespeare. So we would put all the play titles in a hat and have an audience member draw, Titus Andronicus, and then we would just improvise it. And I thought, that sounds really hard.
Going out on a limb. Oh,
yeah.
Try to remember your encyclopedic knowledge of Shakespeare.
Improvising in iambic pentameter. And I felt a bit rusty and totally terrified of that. And then she said, well, what about Goblin Hamlet? And I thought, well, okay, I don't really know Hamlet that well, but what about Macbeth? Because she and I had done a production of Macbeth before. I was quite familiar with the script, as was she. She had an adaptation of the script already done for, I think, 6 actors. So we wrote back to Haysom, or Rebecca called Haysom and said, okay, we're going to do a 2-person Macbeth, but only if we can get these composite effects goblin masks. So she calls down to Composite Effects, and they're like, it's a 6 to 8 week turnaround if you want one. They're $1,000 each. And if you can use 3 of the same, we can ship them to you right away. So
without waiting 6 to 8 weeks.
Wouldn't have to wait 6 to 8 weeks. We can get them within maybe a week or so. And we had planned at this point that Rebecca and I would play all the characters switching off throughout the show. Predominantly, I would play Mackers and she would play Lady Anne, but we would jump around. We would, halfway through a scene, I'd be playing Banquo, and then she'd take over the Banquo part because I had to come in as Duncan or something like that. So we kind of decided on this framework, and we were going to have a musician. So Ellis Lalonde from Calgary, who's just a remarkable musician, he joined us, but not for a couple of weeks because Rebecca and I were still not in the same city. So did another edit of the script, did a reading over Zoom. We met with designers who were in Calgary over Zoom, and the thing just kind of rolled. We met Rebecca got back from Montreal. I got back from Milwaukee. We rehearsed in Stratford for, I want to say 4 days, most of which was spent doing trips to Value Village and Goodwill to find, props and things, and got ourselves as close to off book as we could get and got to Calgary. We worked Ellis in. We did a couple of days of tech, and we did our first run in full mask in front of an audience in Calgary. And it was absolutely terrifying. I think 10 minutes before we went out on stage, one of us said, are we about to completely humiliate ourselves? But it went over like we could not have asked for better. It was Haysom came up with this great phrase that pressure creates diamonds. And it was one of those experiences that just felt so rare and wonderful that, I'm really, really eager to get back at it. That production, it mixes so many elements that I love. It mixes mask work, there's comedy, there's improv within it.
Is there a chance of restaging it for those of us in the East?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's there's still irons in the fire, but we were invited back to Calgary to do a run of it in September, October. We did one high school matinee, and it was on fire. The fact that, because these three goblins sort of show up and they hijack the theater as though they're not supposed to be there. They force a technician to run lights and sound. They take one of the front of house people and hide them backstage, who they later murder because they need a Duncan and they need real blood because they don't understand the difference between pretend and and all that. But they just have this absolute sort of disregard and confusion around humanity, but also why Shakespeare, and that kind of unraveling and proper disrespect of the bard. I think the kids just absolutely loved it, and I can't wait to do it again.
And it also hooks them into Shakespeare because, Shakespeare, we need to attract younger audiences to see live theater.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just have our kids looking at iPads and things like that all the time. They have to have to experience.
Yeah, and that live experience was really, it was really important, and it was incredibly moving to hear the amount of engagement that they were willing to go with. At one point in the show, the English army is approaching the castle, and they're disguised as Burnham Wood. So we get a couple of the kids to go out in the lobby and rip apart this sculpture of a tree and give the tree branches out to the audience. And Rebecca's goblin says, "Okay, so here's what you're going to do. You're going to be the army. When the lights are on you, you're going to hold your branches up, and when the lights come down, you're not in the scene anymore." And they would do this. They would just immediately hold their branches up like they're hiding and kind of wave them towards us. And at one point, Rebecca's kind of in the audience working up the English army. She says, let all your trumpets sound, and all the audience members, they all make this noise, and then they start pounding with their feet on the risers as though they're approaching the castle. And it was heart-stopping to be on stage and just to hear this kind of rush from the audience, and they're yelling charge, and they're getting right into it. I'm like, this is not something you're going to get really anywhere else. Like sitting watching, I mean, beautiful adaptations on film, but honestly, that live theatrical experience is, nothing beats it.